And now for some political analysis. Michael Gerson is a Washington Post columnist and a contributor to The Atlantic. Molly Ball is a national political correspondent for Time magazine, and Susan Glasser is the chief international affairs columnist at Politico. We'd like to welcome Shannon Pettypiece to the broadcast as well. She's a White House correspondent for Bloomberg News. Shannon, let's start off with you. The president softened a little bit on the trade wars this week, took Canada and Mexico off the hit list, at least for now, when it comes to steel and aluminum tariffs. Is there actual wiggle room on this, or is the policy decided?
I think there is wiggle room, and Republicans on Congress are doing everything they can to wiggle as much within that room as possible. Very strong language coming out from even some of Trump's most consistent defenders, Orrin Hatch, saying he doesn't think these tariffs are a good idea. Senator Jeff Flake is getting ready to introduce some legislation that would nullify these, and it's possible they would have enough votes with Democrats, enough Democrats on board. This could be one of the rare moments where Democrats and Republicans can come together because they see the economic consequences of this being so catastrophic for parts of the economy.
To override a presidential veto?
Possibly, yes. We were asking people about that. I mean, there are some Democrats in the Rust Belt, the Tim Ryans of the world, who, support the steel industry and see that as a big area. I don't know specifically his position on this, but in those sort of Rust Belt areas. But a lot of other Democrats who do see the economic consequences of this being very, very damaging.
Molly, does trade become an election issue in the midterms?
It's possible. I mean, you saw the president campaigning yesterday in one of the states where it is a very big election issue. And I've spent a lot of time in central Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, where this is a big deal. And I think that, Trump's political advisors believe this was a key part of his political appeal in 2016. And the reason that he was able to flip those so-called blue wall states of the Rust Belt, the industrial Midwest, there is a powerful political appeal to this tariffs issue. Republican policymakers are pretty much uniformly set against it. Republican voters are not. And Republican-leaning independent voters in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, the trade deal was, in the Republican primary, one of Trump's biggest differences with the other candidates in that field, because he sensed, I think correctly, as Ross Perot did before him and Pat Buchanan, that there is a constituency even among Republican voters for tariffs.
And Michael, the president said last night Ronald Reagan wasn't good on trade.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan's an icon typically for Republicans.
Yeah, he doesn't respect icons in that way. I think that this is revealing in an entirely different way. I mean, Republicans really have come together, 107 of them, to resist the president's policy on this. But when you look at all the previous provocations where they might be critical of the president, it's tariffs, it's not misogyny, it's not nativism and racism. It reveals something about the Republican Party that this is their red line.
Right. Don't mess with aluminum.
Right.
Don't mess with aluminum.
Exactly.
And so Gary Cohn stayed in place after Charlottesville, but he quit over this.
Yeah. So I think it's revealing.
What do you think it reveals? That it's truly about economic policy when it comes to Republican
I'll quote
agenda?
St. Augustine. He talked about the order of the loves. This is their order of their loves. This is what they really value in life. And I think that that's a serious problem for Republicans. They need to show some passion, I think, for recovery in the future on some other issues that are in resisting the Trump agenda.
Well, Susan, you've written a bit about, though, as well, in terms of flipping the script on the Republican agenda, the change towards Russia and how this has somehow become a partisan issue.
Well, that's right. It used to be just as Republicans were the bedrock party of free trade, right? If there's one thing we knew that was the consensus of the Republican Party on, it was free trade. The same thing was true on the hawkishness toward Russia, which generally had prevailed and persisted through the end of the Cold War. Now you look at those public opinion surveys, and basically, because the party's standard bearer, Donald Trump, has changed his view last year in 2016, the Republican electorate changed their view in an astonishingly short period of time. So this coming weekend, Vladimir Putin will be up for his sort of token re-election. He's already the longest serving Russian leader since Joseph Stalin. Now he has the prospect of 6 more years. You have, by the way, today, as we're having this conversation, it hasn't come up, but Xi Jinping will be basically now rubber stamped as a leader for life in China. They're eliminating term limits on their leadership today. These two incredibly significant geopolitical things are happening in the context of an American presidency this week. We see more clearly than any other. It's a presidency, as someone in my household wrote, a presidency of one. You see him shedding advisors, unclear whether he's listening to the counsel of others. And I think that goes to the politics. The Republican Party doesn't really know what it stands for anymore under President Trump.
And you recently interviewed Senator Jim Risch, who would take control of Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we believe, if Bob Corker does what he says he's going to do and step down. And that leaves some oversight, at least for foreign policy, somewhat unchecked in your description of your conversation with him.
Well, I think this underscores what we're talking about. You have basically a Republican Party that's deeply uncomfortable, at least on Capitol Hill, with many of the president's policy positions, whether it's his favorable comments toward Vladimir Putin, whether it's his jettisoning of the party's traditional free trade stance. And yet the political imperatives, they're afraid to directly challenge him. It's interesting that some of them are speaking out on trade. And I think that's what I came away with thinking. The future chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee doesn't really agree with the president on many of these foreign policy issues, and yet his articulated goal for the committee would be not to criticize and stand up to him the way that Bob Corker has.
Michael, I want to ask you, you just wrote an in-depth piece about sort of the struggle within, or as you see it, the search for the soul of the evangelical movement in many ways. You say they've lost their interest in decency. What do you think the evangelicals who support President Trump make of this Stormy Daniels scandal?
Well, I think that it's the height of hypocrisy, and we saw it with Roy Moore as well. If any other Democratic president had been guilty of what is alleged in these cases, evangelicals would be, off the reservation. This is a case where their morality seems to be determined by their politics, and they've ceased to be moral leaders in that sense. It was a tough choice for many evangelicals between Hillary Clinton and the president, and I understand that. But they have been the most sycophantic element of the Republican coalition, which is unnecessary. They have not provided that moral judgment that I think leavens our politics, or should leaven our politics. And so, I've done this piece in The Atlantic, essentially arguing that they're betraying a great tradition. Evangelicalism really has had a good tradition, and now they're really undermining that reputation of their faith.
But in that judgment, you're saying the transactional part of this relationship isn't worth the trade-off?
Well, they're acting like, slimy political operatives, not moral leaders. They're essentially saying in order to get benefits for themselves in a certain way, they talk about religious liberty and other issues, but to get benefits for themselves, they're willing to wink at Stormy Daniels and wink at misogyny and wink at nativism. And that, I think, is deeply discrediting, not just in a political sense, but actually in a moral and religious sense.
Molly, I think a lot of people don't really know what to make of this scandal. It seems sordid, but now we're talking about it sort of bleeding into questions about campaign finance and further legal issues for the president, whose position has simply been, none of this ever happened, it's all made up.
Well, and he can say that, but that doesn't make it go away. And I do think that we've seen this scandal have surprising staying power because of the legal issues involved. If it were simply yet another woman accusing Donald Trump of improper behavior, which she certainly is not the first, although in this case what's being alleged is a consensual extramarital affair, not, as in some other cases, a form of harassment. In this case, though, there is this legal arbitration, this legal contract between the president's lawyer and Stormy Daniels, which the White House acknowledged this week exists and is still going through an arbitration process. And then there is this campaign finance technicality, although I think it's quite questionable whether that would actually be assessed by a court. But you do have these issues where, because the president, through his lawyer, allegedly went to great lengths to try to silence this story and cover up this alleged affair, that this is not going to go away.